want to begin with a warning tonight. Some information may stir up or trigger unpleasant feelings or thoughts.
The remains of 215 children.
It was devastating to know that there's 215.
The work around residential schools is the root of so many of the other systemic issues that Indigenous people face today.
You don't just, oops, I created a genocidal machine known as residential schools. There's a lot of thought, planning, processes.
That's colonialism.
Taking away resources, taking away opportunities, taking away families.
We are not fighting Indigenous kids in court.
And yet that next week, we were going to federal court to defend children against the government of Canada.
This is exactly according to the Colonial Playbook. We now know their plays.
Hey, anyone getting close to us, back away!
How do we respond now?
It is often said that truth must come before reconciliation, and less than 6 months ago on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, Canada was delivered a difficult dose of truth.
The remains of 215 children were found at a former residential school in British Columbia. The Sioux Valley Dakota Nation in Manitoba.
And quickly, the numbers of lost ancestors on former residential school grounds continued to be counted.
At least 750 unmarked graves have been found at the Cowsis Residential School in Saskatchewan.
These unmarked graves were not discoveries, however. They were confirmations. Confirmations for what survivors had already known for decades.
The Canadian government has also known about abandoned residential school graves for generations. As early as 1914, the government was warned about abandoned cemeteries containing children from residential schools. One in Battleford was said to contain the bodies of 70 to 80, mostly former students.
So, here we are, the Mohawk Institute, Canada's first established residential school. My great aunt and uncles went here. They all suffered abuse here. And I'm here to remember, and there's a whole new generation of people remembering and reminding. But it begs the question, how could Canada forget this?
Ahead of Canada Day, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Carolyn Bennett commented on the confirmations of unmarked graves, and she did what many Canadian officials have done in her place. She reflected.
Understanding that harm was done.
She apologized.
That we're sorry.
She made promises to make things better and made a symbolic gesture.
On Canada Day, I will be wearing an orange shirt. And I do think that lots of people feel that that would be the appropriate thing to do.
And continue to uphold Canada.
As well as celebrating the best country in the world, but that made some very terrible mistakes.
But it wasn't a mistake. There is no mistake about it. It was intentional. It was deliberate and willful. So Minister Bennett is wrong on that.
These are not schools where people were sent to become university professors or to become mathematicians or to become engineers. It was never intended to create an equal footing for all people. And so it's not a mistake, it was a plan, and it was a very deliberate plan. And if we don't acknowledge that plan, then we can never move past it.
University of Ottawa historian Timothy Stanley can trace the origins of Canada's colonial present to one of its founders, John A. Macdonald. Stanley shares how Macdonald's racism rocked the House in 1885.
He's the only person in the House of Commons and the Senate who actually uses the term Aryan during this time. So his idea is that Canada should be founded by a pure Aryan race as well.
Stanley says that Macdonald integrated his ideas about racial superiority in a way that hadn't been done before.
What he's doing, he's the first person, as far as I know, in the British Empire to take biologically defined notions of race and make them into law. But our national mythology is that he's the founder of this multicultural, tolerant Canada. So to me, in 1885, Johnny MacDonald is really inventing a Canadian white supremacy.
Colonialism is not just something from the history books, it's alive and living today. The foundation of the very house of Canada.
I think that Canada is socializing its citizenry into thinking that we're in an era of reconciliation and nation to nation, but at the level of practice, that is not true.
Look at what happened in residential schools. They stole our children, put them into residential schools in the care of someone else, where they were abused, and many didn't make it out alive. What's happening in the current foster care crisis today? Stealing our children, putting them in the care of other people, where statistically we know they're far less likely to graduate from high school, they're far more likely to be sexually abused, physically abused, end up in youth corrections, end up living on the street, and more likely to be incarcerated as an adult or live in poverty. So there really isn't a policy that you can point to from the past that doesn't continue today, perhaps even under a different name.
APTN Investigates has unearthed a confidential memo that details Canada's intent in continuing colonial policies against First Nations. This 1970 memo from the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development noted the unanimously unfavorable rejection of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's white paper, which Indigenous groups at the time called cultural genocide. Despite this, David A. Munro, Assistant Deputy Minister, proposed furthering the agenda of the white paper covertly through a change in tactics, strategy, or policy content. Munro's idea was to unpack the white paper into smaller parts, to adopt different tactics, but not to depart from its essential content. You can see how Canada's colonial tactics continue to be covert. According to a Queen's University study, since 2005, a list of at least 47 statutes and bills have attempted to circumvent the Indian Act to control the finances, territories, rights, and governance of Indigenous peoples.
Canada's tactics, you could argue, are part of a colonial playbook, a playbook designed to delay and deny Indigenous justice.
Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard has been at the forefront of countering Canada's colonial playbook. His foundational 2014 book, Red Skin, White Masks, shed much-needed light on Canada's colonial politics.
When we focus on residential schools, or we focus on any singular aspect of this process, it doesn't give the broader picture. When the recognition, like the offering of certain sort of gifts or trinkets or whatever, doesn't placate Indigenous peoples, it doesn't function in the way to pacify our resistance, you'll always see the hammer come down. And that's the Wet'suwet'en breach of the blockade by the cops, and the extraordinary force that they used is an example of that.
This is exactly according to the Colonial Playbook. We now know their plays. How do we respond now? And one of the things is not accepting what they've continually done over generations and hundreds of years.
Well, we know residential schools wasn't a mistake. You don't just, oops, I created a genocidal machine known as residential schools. There's a lot of thought, planning, and we know what the final solution was. It was to get rid of Indians. And how could you say that all of these kids dying is the final solution and not think that that was an intentional genocide? When their own lawyers were saying, you know what, you're coming dangerously close to a charge of manslaughter here. So everyone knew what was going on, including the RCMP, including the churches, and that's why such great efforts were taken to conceal it all.
It is a real rough pine box with a body bag inside the pine box.
And how old were you?
I think I was about 15. And my two helpers were probably 13, 14.
And how often were students here told by staff to bury bodies like that on the grounds?
It was certainly yearly.
Gitson Chief George Muldoe has traveled from BC to Alberta to the former site of the Edmonton Indian Residential School to show us where he once buried a body as a schoolboy. Back in January of 1959, this was the principal's house. And one Friday afternoon that January, a truck pulled up with a dead person in the back.
Well, the supervisor just told us grave detail, gave us a pick and shovel, and nobody told us where to dig, and nobody told us who the person was. When the body came, we could see it was an adult, and it was up to us to bury it. There's never a preacher, no relatives. Nobody showed up with the body, not even from the school, no supervisors.
The bodies these kids were being told to bury were coming from Charles Camsell Hospital, a so-called Indian hospital with many tuberculosis patients. Muldoe's been in many meetings about these graves with the United Church, which ran the Edmonton Indian Residential School, and the federal government, which contracted the church to run it.
Canada used to ask me, well, what do you guys want anyway? I said, send them home. And again, the same answer, too expensive to do that. And the same answer today.
Keisha Supernat is director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta, and she's busier than she's ever been. Busy fielding calls and assisting communities as they try to get funding for their own ground-penetrating radar surveys. Ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, involves a radar device on wheels which emits radio waves downward. Used properly, it can detect soil disturbances and underground anomalies such as graves. And in the Truth and Reconciliation process, Supernat is mindful of the need for GPR to prove what Indigenous people have been saying all along.
It does take this ground-penetrating radar, I think, to communicate that truth to non-Indigenous people. And I'm happy that that's happening now. I just really wish that survivors had been believed when they first started to tell those stories about what happened, and that they knew where those graves were likely located.
But as this year of reckoning progresses, there are challenges in Supernat's field.
There is a real capacity issue, and not so much in terms of, machines of ground-penetrating radar, or even people who might know how to run them. It's more so, this is a very specific application of ground-penetrating radar. It was developed to look for infrastructure, not developed to look for unmarked graves. And there's only a small number of people who actually have used it for that purpose in Canada.
Supernat notes the increasing calls for criminal investigations to be done.
We've heard a lot of talk about crime scenes and criminal investigations, and I think that if communities want to pursue that, they should be supported to do so, but that it should not be done by the RCMP, and it should be done by perhaps an international independent body, because I don't think it's appropriate for the federal government to be investigating itself on this. So if there is going to be, pushing for that more criminal approach, which many communities are asking for, then I think we need to ensure that there's an independent process for doing so.
APTN Investigates reached out to the United Church as well as the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. We spoke with the head, or moderator, of the United Church, the Right Reverend Richard Bott.
The first thing that I would want to say is we know that what you are telling us is the truth of what happened. The second thing that I want to say is it was wrong. What we did in making all of the boys who did this dig graves was child labor. It was devaluing you as a person, and it should never, ever have happened. I believe that the United Church of Canada is open to conversation about what is appropriate, about what is right for reparation, what is right for restoration of relationship. So would we be willing to sit down and listen? Absolutely. Absolutely.
The Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs sent APTN Investigates a statement. In the statement, they highlighted several previous funding announcements before concluding, "We are listening and will ensure that all responsive measures are Indigenous-led, survivor-centric, and culturally sensitive." The Alberta government tells APTN Investigates that an application has been made for funding to probe the former Edmonton Indian Residential School site where bodies were buried. And Supernant says because residential schools had such a destructive effect, we owe it to the people affected to spend the money and do the GPR.
I wish that people like George would have been believed the first time. When he could come out here and say, there are graves here, I dug them, I know where they are. There are stories like that in communities. And it does take this ground-penetrating radar, I think, to communicate that truth to non-Indigenous people. And I'm happy that that's happening now. I just really wish that survivors had been believed when they first started to tell those stories.
Cindy Blackstock has seen it all. Here, at Ottawa's Rideau Falls, is where she often comes to reflect. It's easy to see why. Within the mist, the light refracts into a rainbow, and ducks like to feed along the fall's edge. But there is another view too. In the distance, the headquarters for Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. APTN has followed Blackstock's long battle against the Government of Canada every step of the way.
Cindy Blackstock.
Cindy Blackstock.
Cindy Blackstock.
Cindy Blackstock.
Cindy Blackstock.
Blackstock is no stranger to federal politicians. She's been in a long-standing battle against the federal government over First Nations child welfare. That began when the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and the Assembly of First Nations opened a human rights complaint in 2007. It took 6 years for that hearing to begin.
Thousands of documents later, millions spent in legal fees, and battle after battle, Blackstock's team has forced Canada's own courts to pay up for underfunding Indigenous child welfare programs.
The real test of law is when the government can be found guilty in its own courts and respect the decision.
And by doing so, she's also shined a light on Canada's adversarial relationship with all Indigenous peoples. Of course, Canada stares back at Cindy Blackstock.
Big Brother is watching. It's something Cindy Blackstock is experiencing firsthand.
When is an advocate for Aboriginal children considered an enemy of the state? Apparently when she files a human rights complaint about willful underfunding of welfare services for First Nation children.
Mr. Speaker, we take Canadians' privacy very seriously. I've asked my Deputy Minister to report on whether privacy rules were respected in this case.
Her main message was predictable. First Nations children are underfunded by the government. Well, that's predictable because it's true.
There are numerous employees on government payroll who are being asked to comment on what I'm doing or to violate my privacy by going onto my personal Facebook pages.
Strelkova describes why she monitored Blackstock's personal Facebook page.
But why didn't you just ask Cindy Blackstock, can I have access to your page?
She's on a different team.
And keep in mind that the Privacy Commissioner already found this to be a breach of the privacy law. So they've broken the law, and yet they aren't agreeing to stop breaking the law with saying this undertaking. It's really disturbing to me.
Despite its attempts, Canada rarely gets to see Blackstock at home. In fact, it's the first time she's allowed a TV crew here.
I get up really early. That's the time when I can think the clearest. And one of the things I do is I go downstairs and I grab the newspaper. Because part of being able to frame what's happening to First Nations kids is to see and understand what's happening in the world around you. And then after that, I head upstairs. I start to read or I start to write. And when it comes to the tribunal, I read all the orders. I read all of Canada's arguments. And then I prepare myself to be able to kind of counter some of those arguments, or to accept some of their arguments if they're legitimate. They're not often legitimate, though.
Clocks are everywhere in her home.
I'm always wearing a wristwatch. Those mean a lot to me.
Nowhere else does the passing of time feel more consequential than here at Canada's National Cemetery, the literal resting place for the leaders of Canada's colonial legacy.
Does Canada have a colonial playbook? What do you think of the idea?
Oh, Canada has a colonial playbook, and it is handed down from ancestor to ancestor in the bureaucracy of Indigenous affairs and also within the government. I often feel like I'm getting a front row seat for this short period of history that I'm involved on First Nations kids watching a rerun of a movie. And every new bureaucrat I see thinks that they're doing something completely different than the past. And what I see is exactly what I've seen before.
Over the summer, Blackstock's First Nations Child and Family Caring Society was in federal court, in part to defend the landmark Jordan's Principle policy that ensures First Nations children are not denied public services while provincial or federal governments fight over who should pay.
One of the orders that the Canadian government was challenging is they don't want Jordan's Principle to apply to non-status kids off reserve.
The week before heading to court in June, Blackstock was shocked by a televised debate.
I remember seeing Prime Minister Trudeau stand up in the House of Commons in the wake of the affirmation of the survivors' truths in Kamloops.
We are not fighting Indigenous kids in court.
I was gobsmacked. Like, how can you rise in the House of Commons and deny what is an absolute verifiable truth, which is we were going to federal court and it was going to be webcast. And it was going to be covered by media such as APTN. Anyone could watch. And yet that shows us where we are in this whole colonialism debate, is that the government still feels it can stand up and really lie to Canadians and lie to itself. I mean, think about it. If you were responsible for the deaths and the harms of children in residential schools as an institution, and then you went on to do the same kind of behavior with the 60s scoop. And then you litigate against this generation of kids, only to lose in your own courts, that find that you're racially discriminating against little kids in ways that separate them from their families, harm them, and contribute to their deaths. And you choose not to implement the orders. 20 non-compliance and procedure orders since 2016. That's not a mistake. That's a choice.
On September 29th, the federal court upheld Jordan's Principle for non-status kids and a landmark multi-billion-dollar compensation order for First Nations who faced mistreatment within the child welfare system. It is the 28th ruling in Blackstock's favor against the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada has until October 29th to appeal this latest decision.